By now, however, time was running short. Anderson had said he could hold out. In other words, his food would last only until April 15th, and that was on short rations. And it was already March 29th. Lincoln wanted the expedition to move by April 6th, in other words, in 1 week. Remember that Lincoln's administration was only a month old at this point, and as might have been expected, there were a number of rather serious glitches as it tried to respond in a hurry to a time-sensitive crisis. The first decision was the most important. He would reinforce Fort Sumter. But effecting that resupply proved almost too much for the Young administration. One complicating factor was that Seward was not ready to give up on his idea of letting Sumter go by default while making a big show of reinforcing Pickens. One complicating factor was that Seward was not ready to give up on his idea of letting Sumter go by default while making a big show of reinforcing Pickens. He was soon back at the White House to push this idea, and this time he brought with him two relatively young officers. One of them was Army Captain Montgomery Meigs. The other man you will recognize. That is, of course, David Dixon Porter. Seward told Lincoln that Captain Meigs had come up with a plan to secure Fort Pickens off the coast of Florida using the warship Powhatan, and that Lieutenant Porter had seen the plan and approved of it. Well, of course he did, because that plan included giving Lieutenant Porter the command of the ship. "What will Uncle Gideon say?" Lincoln asked him, referring to Gideon Welles, Secretary of the Navy. Seward waved off that detail. "I will make it right with Mr. Welles," he said. So Lincoln thereupon gave his consent to organize a second expedition to Fort Pickens, using the steamer Powhatan, unaware as he did so that Wells had already designated that vessel to spearhead the relief expedition to Fort Sumter. Since time was short, Meigs and Porter went into the next room so they could write the orders for the President to sign. Porter wrote one order giving himself command of the Powhatan, and another authorizing the acting commandant at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, Andrew Hull Foote, to prepare that ship for an undisclosed sea duty. Because Porter insisted that the fewer people who knew about this, the more likely it would be successful, the second order also directed that under no circumstance was Foote to communicate to the Navy Department that the ship is fitting out. Similarly, Meigs' orders to the commander of the embarked soldiers declared that the object and destination of this expedition will be communicated to no one to whom it is not already known. Apparently that included the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles. Lincoln told one of his private secretaries, John Nicolay, to ensure that Welles got copies of the papers, but as it turned out, not all the papers, and Welles remained ignorant of this second set of orders concerning the Powhatan. So as a result of all this, by the evening of April 1st, appropriately April Fool's Day, two separate Union naval expeditions were being assembled, one for Fort Sumter, one for Fort Pickens, both of them involving the USS Powhatan. But in the entire country, only 4 men, Lincoln, Seward, Meigs, and Porter, were aware of it. Consequently, the flurry of orders sent out that day created as much confusion as they did direction. And much of that confusion surrounded, of course, the ship USS Powhatan. Foote, who commanded the Brooklyn Navy Yard where the Powhatan was fitting out, thought this was curious that he got two sets of orders to prepare this ship for a special mission. One of those, signed by the President himself, told him he was to keep this secret from the Secretary of the Navy, who's the one who sent him the other set of orders. When Gideon Welles finally found out about the heretofore secret Pickens expedition on April 5th, 150 years ago today, he charged over to the White House to complain about it. The President immediately countermanded the orders for the Powhatan to go to Pensacola and ordered Seward to stop her at once. And so it was that David Dixon Porter, on the quarterdeck of the Powhatan, preparing to go to sea, got a telegram from Seward that day telling him to give up the Powhatan to Captain Mercer. Well, here's a dilemma. Porter had orders which he had written himself, that were signed by the President of the United States in his pocket. And here was a telegram from the Secretary of State, Seward, telling him to give up the ship to Captain Mercer. What took priority? After thinking about it for only a minute or two, Porter decided to ignore Seward's telegram and proceed on his mission. And he left New York Harbor early on the morning of April 6th. While both of these expeditions headed south, another dispute emerged over the question of notifying the South Carolinians. Seward may well have hoped that dispatching the expedition to Fort Pickens would encourage Lincoln to put the Sumter expedition on hold, but it didn't. And that put Seward in a rather awkward position because he had already, on his own, assured Southern representatives that the government would make no attempt to reinforce Fort Sumter without advance notice. He now told Lincoln that the administration was honor-bound to live up to that pledge. Welles opposed it, arguing that Seward, first of all, had no right to give such a pledge on behalf of the administration, and the government had no obligation to live up to it now. After all, he argued, a key element of Fox's expedition was stealth, going in the middle of the night in these small boats to notify the secessionists that an expedition was en route, jeopardized its potential for success, and put Fox and all those who sailed with him in jeopardy.
Frontmen in Tokyo's drama of treachery, Nomura and Kurusu. Japan labeled them peace envoys, arriving at Secretary Hull's office for an interview they requested. Big news. They bring Tokyo's answer to the U.S. note proposing an end to aggression in Asia. Gist of the reply, Japan very sorry. Their protestations are ever so peaceful. Their oily smiles, their continual pleas for more time have served their purpose, giving Tokyo time to complete all arrangements for that first unprovoked assault. Even as the peace envoys talked with Secretary Hull, American territory was being bombed.
On Sunday, December 7th, 1941, shortly before 8 a.m., Japan launched a surprise attack on the United States of America by bombing the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Now, it's impossible to know exactly what Lincoln believed such a message might accomplish. Many have argued that this was the masterstroke of Lincoln's whole policy concerning Sumter, that it was a deliberate ploy by Lincoln to compel the rebel leaders to make a decision. According to this view, letting the secessionists know that the expedition was coming would force them into a provocative act, and that act would cast the Union as the victim. Now that, of course, is finally what happened. It's less clear that Lincoln counted on that outcome. Very likely he had more modest expectations and was sufficiently flexible to deal with a variety of responses. Minimally, at least, the message would absolve Lincoln of making a treacherous assault on South Carolina, of being the aggressor, as he had pledged not to do in his inaugural address. Moreover, it was at least possible that local authorities might acquiesce in the landing of those supplies. which would prolong the crisis and allow more time to find that peaceful solution which he declared in his inaugural was his goal. The note that Lincoln sent to South Carolina's governor arrived on April 8th, and wanting no part of making that decision himself, Pickens passed the buck to Brigadier General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, one of the great names of the Civil War, who in turn passed it on to the Confederate president in Montgomery. So that in the end, it was this man, Jefferson Davis, who decided that allowing Fort Sumter to be resupplied violated the Confederacy's claim to sovereignty, and more afraid of looking weak than he was of starting a war, he ordered Beauregard to demand Anderson's surrender, and if that demand were refused, to reduce the fort by gunfire. That first shot was fired just minutes after the first Union ship reached the rendezvous point off Charleston Harbor.
pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice.